Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormer and you can see I'm preparing to set up my new time-lapse. Still don't know exactly how it's going to be laid out, but I need just the basic structure of it. And then what I put into the bin as far as the layout and the type of worms I use, that's all kind of up in the air right now. I'm not sure where that's going to lead, but I'm going to get that out of our way so we can get one of these bins up onto the bench and check it out. It's the bin that is now my oldest bin. 1 week ago when we last checked in on it, it was not yet my oldest bin, but now it is. The one that was older last week, 3 days later, was harvested, and this has since become the oldest bin. It's 160 days of age at this point, and the last 28 days of those have been spent foraging. So up until that point, I was giving the system regular portions of kitchen scraps and bedding and stuff like that, which the worms have done a really great job breaking down, and there's still a lot of residual bits of that left in here. So that was the main purpose over the past 28 days of the bin not receiving any fresh food, was that hopefully the worms are going to turn their attention to breaking all that leftover material down. Then we can really treat this as like a system full of finished compost versus a mixture of compost plus a bunch of other stuff. So I'm always curious to see how one of these is progressing over time. After a week, I don't know, I guess we'll see how it's coming along. I'm going to put a glove on, got to make some room on the bench. And then we'll get this over there and we'll take a look at how it's progressing. Now, other than blocking out the light, all of these paper and cardboard coverings are not really performing much of a function because it's a little bit hard to see, but as I remove them all, you'll notice that the primary covering at this point has become the plastic that I placed on here after last check-in. I don't think it was even part of the video. I think it was sort of an afterthought, because when we checked in last, we had found that the material in the bin was starting to exhibit signs of maybe becoming a little bit drier than ideal. And it did seem to me like if the material in the bin is to be broken down by these little worms, then we need to make sure that the material is nice and damp, because they can't really make much with dry, arid materials, or for that matter, they can't really do well living in arid, dry conditions. They rely real heavily on the moisture since they don't have lungs and they don't inhale air the way you and I breathe. They breathe through their skins, and the oxygen that they utilize actually comes through the moisture that they inhabit, if that makes sense. So in other words, they need to be in an environment where they're kept nice and damp all the time, and that's where they're able to most easily obtain their oxygen and remain vibrant and healthy and active. I guess the catch-22 on that is that the plastic is maintaining the moisture in the system, but it's also stifling airflow. So you really got to be careful with the plastic. There's a tipping point where it's helping with the moisture retention, but eventually it could actually turn around and bite you by restricting the airflow and limiting the availability of oxygen in the system. Something we've been doing in this bin lately is running a time lapse after each check-in, at least for the past few times, because I found that the worms that inhabit this system, which is a mix of different types of worms, there's supposedly red wigglers and European night crawlers in here, but for the most part I believe the population in this bin is Indian blue worms. And they're a little bit flighty, they're a little bit skittish. So like sometimes they seem to react to weather changes, they seem to not appreciate having their space tilled up and fiddled around with. Sometimes I see hours and hours and hours of worm activity on the surface here, and I capture it using a time-lapse filming technique so that those many hours that pass can be observed in the matter of just a few seconds. And the worms sometimes go crazy crawling around in here. So So I'm probably going to do the same after we're done checking the bin today to see if same stuff's going on here afterwards. I'm just worried that, worms are going to crawl out of the system and end up stranded in a dry place where they're going to pretty much die. So the material is definitely coming along good, but you got to admit, as you look through it, there's an abundant quantity of little sticks and stems from leaves that were used as bedding, other forms of bedding that have lingering residual bits of them, like paper. So this is something that you might not truly consider to be clean, finished, 100% castings. Some people might say, hey, it's good enough, it looks good to me, let's give it to the plants. Let the rest of the decomposition of the material occur outside in the garden. Lots of different points of view on this stuff. Obviously, if you were selling this stuff commercially, you would need it to be really fine and pretty much castings only. If you're doing it for your own home purposes, you might consider what you see here as pretty close or good enough to be deemed the finished product. I'm in no hurry, we're just starting to enter the autumn time frame. So I'm a long way away from needing to build a new garden. I usually don't do a winter crop or anything like that. So these castings will most likely just sit anyway before they get utilized. So I believe what's really going to occur in here is just more time for the material in here to continue breaking down. Every time I find something a little bit larger, I assume that it would just help to break it into smaller bits, separated from anything it might be adhering to. So you could tell there's good amounts of mostly bedding in here at this point, I would think. Stuff like this, the shell of an avocado, I guess would probably register more as food. But it's the tough sort of material that takes time to break down. The one place in this bin where we would definitely find a lot of leftovers is right down the middle. Because for a few weeks prior to me applying the plastic to the top of this, I was attempting to address dry materials that were usually found out on the top surface. I would collect them up over the course of the check-in and then submerge them down within the middle of the bin to expose them to moisture and help them get into the action. Otherwise they'd just be abandoned out on the top surface and never break down. But I think the plastic kind of provides a lot more moisture to all of the bin versus only submerged material benefiting from having a good high moisture content. So now I think I've already decided that I'm just going to let foraging in here continue because, like I said, I'm in no rush. But at some point, I will want to sort of give this thing the blessing and say, close enough. Let's start initiating the movement of the worms out of the material. I mean, I could do that right now. I could start just shining bright lights on here. Within a minute or two, you'll see no more worms on the surface. And then gradually you can start skimming the material off the top, driving the worms further and further down on each pass, and then eventually ending up with a bunch of castings that you've skimmed off the top, collected in one place, and then the remainder of the contents of the bin, which at that point would be mainly the worms, would be at the bottom. And that's a separation method they refer to as light harvesting, so you can kind of harvest your castings utilizing the tendency of the worms to want to dive down into the material and get out of the bright light. But I usually opt for a much slower method of separating worms from the castings that they inhabit, which is just to let them on their own disembark from the material. And I mean, they don't do that on their own. Basically, you need to provide them with some stimulus or some motivation to do that. And in my case, I'll usually allow the material that they're inhabiting to go dry. I'll just let it air out and continue to dry over time gradually, making it less and less appealing for the worms to remain in. And then eventually I'll just set up one end of the bin like a little paradise, with all fresh bedding, fresh food, a good supply of moisture, because there I'll cover with plastic, whereas the rest of the material that I'm allowing to dry would be, covered maybe with nothing, or possibly just something that does allow for some evaporation. So I will at some point soon get to that stage in here, but I don't think we're ready for that. There's a good amount of leftovers in here. I believe, though, maybe next time we check in here, maybe we'll give this another week or so, and then maybe on day 35 of foraging, we'll make the decision to switch over to migration. I think one of the mistakes I make sometimes is like wanting to see things reach 100%, Like, oh no, I can't start migration. We need to keep foraging until this piece of scrap here is broken down. And I think that's kind of the thinking that ends up causing more harm than good, I guess. I think that maybe the better approach is to sort of try to run some of these activities in parallel. I bet you can just initiate a migration of the adult worms out of this system, get them into a new space, let them start doing their work elsewhere, and then at some point soon, all the cocoons in this material are going to start hatching. We're going to have a whole new generation of baby worms coming to life in here, even though we had just recently migrated all the adult worms out. So I think, I think it makes good sense to leave behind a little bit of scrap, bedding, and food, even after the worms have been migrated out, if you're going to keep the material around as sort of a cocoon nursery going forward. And I think that might be the approach to take. I mean, this whole cocoon nursery thing is something I only recently adopted into my process. I used to just light harvest, get the worms into their new space, use the castings in the garden, cocoons and all. But more recently, I've been paying a little bit more attention to the cocoons that I know are always there everywhere, and giving them time to hatch so that I can keep the baby worms that emerge from them as part of my worm farm versus constantly just releasing them. So we've kind of tilled around here. You got to admit, this stuff is really nice. Everything you touch kind of crumbles. Some stuff is obviously leftover stuff, but mixed in with it all is just a whole bunch of really beautiful castings everywhere. And pretty much worms everywhere as well. I think before we put the plastic back on and cover up over here, I just figure let's check the middle, because the middle is where, you can see me, I'm collecting a bunch of this large chunk material I'm bumping into. Every time I've done this in the past, I've always submerged this stuff right down here to the middle, and that's the reason I wanted to save this part of the bin for last. Because in theory, that's kind of where all the food scraps and bedding bits that I've collected over time, over the past few check-ins, has been accumulating. And you would think that would maybe become the spot where the worms want to be, because that's really where all the larger leftovers have been getting positioned. But I'm not really finding as much in here as I expected. I remember taking handfuls of stuff similar to this and placing it all down there. And maybe that was just what the doctor ordered, because it almost looks like they've actually done away with a good portion of it. I thought I'd be combing my fingers through this stuff and coming up with tons of this stuff. But I'm finding very little. So maybe that is the trick here. Maybe I just got to keep collecting up all the large scrap stuff that I keep bumping into and just keep dumping it down in the middle. And then maybe at some point when it comes time to set up the migration of the worms, instead of dumping it down the middle, I'll just stick it out on the edge of the bin rather than in the middle. And then that edge of the bin will become the space in the bin where we want to try to lure the worms over into. And then at that time, we won't just move this leftover stuff. We'll also include a whole bunch of nice fresh bedding, fresh food, cover that area with plastic, make it into like an irresistible place for the worms to go to. Or even if they just stumble on it by accident, make it such that they wouldn't want to leave. All right, I think we're done here. It's just kind of fun, I can't seem to resist checking out every cubic centimeter of a bin like this, because it is interesting. You know what else is interesting is that last week when we checked in here, we kind of went in the opposite order. We first checked how the old collected bits of leftover scraps were coming along down the middle. We were a little bit surprised to find that there weren't a bunch of worms hanging out there mobbing this stuff. And then we proceeded to check the outer edges of the bin. And then in two of the corners, I think it might have been in this corner here, we extracted a massive handful of worms. And then I think it might have been in this corner over here, we bumped into that corner later to find the same thing, yet another huge mound of worms huddled together. And maybe those were just like the last few larger scraps of food left in this bin, because I'm finding little bits of leftover mango seed. That's the husk of it right there, as is this. But as far as leftover foods, okay, I'm sorry, there was this too, right? I found a little fragment of an old banana stem. But other than those couple little bits and the bedding scraps, there's really not a whole lot left in this bin as far as food goes. And you know, you don't have to feel bad for the worms, because the worms, they're genius. They know not to starve. So if they're unable to locate fresh food to consume, they can always turn right back to the castings that they had created previously, because their digestive system is so fast that it just does not have the time to extract 100% of the nutrition out of the things that they're consuming. They're just constantly consuming, expelling a lot of leftovers that are still abundantly saturated with residual nutritional value. So the castings that the worms leave behind can ultimately end up being their food supply for quite a while going forward. They can consume this stuff over and over again, maybe half a dozen or more times before the stuff is completely depleted of nutritional value for them. So that's kind of an interesting little tidbit not everyone knows, but all right, what else? I don't think we've got much of anything else to do. I had thought about maybe adding moisture if I thought that it might help. I don't think it's necessary. Everything feels just about right. And I think if we go back to covering up with the plastic again, it'll keep the moisture just right going forward. So I'll cover up after we close up shop here, but I am going to leave the bin open, because I am going to do another after check-in time lapse. Because I am always curious to see what these worms are going to do after I call it a day down here. And this particular bin, the worms are just kind of bananas. So yeah, I'm gonna switch to the other camera, which is really a little bit better suited for time-lapse footage. And then I could take this footage we just shot here, and I'll take it up to the computer and start putting together the video about it. And then maybe around the time I get finished with that, we might have some couple hours worth of footage to ponder to see how these little wormies are doing following this pretty intrusive check-in on their environment. So let me proceed with taking care of that. I got a couple things to put away and clean up, and then I can get that time lapse started. But before I split to take care of that, let me just really quickly say thank you. Thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up. That's always very much appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's very much appreciated as well. Hang on for the time lapse. It's coming up next. And we'll see you back here next time. Thanks for watching.